The Closed Shop, a short story by Somerset Maugham. Nothing would induce me to tell the name of the happy country in which the incidents occurred that I am constrained to relate, but I see no harm in admitting that it is a free and independent state on the continent of America. This is vague enough in all conscience and can give rise to no diplomatic incident. Now the president of this free and independent state had an eye to a pretty woman, and there came to his capital, a wide and sunny town with a plaza, a cathedral that was not without dignity and a few old Spanish houses, a young person from Michigan of such a pleasing aspect that his heart went out to her. He lost no time in declaring his passion, and was gratified to learn that it was returned, but he was mortified to discover that the young person regarded his possession of a wife and her possession of a husband as a bar to their union. She had a feminine weakness for marriage. Though it seemed unreasonable to the president, he was not the man to refuse a pretty woman the gratification of her whim, and promised to make such arrangements as would enable him to offer her wedlock. He called his attorneys together and put the matter before them. He had long thought, he said, that for a progressive country their marriage laws were remarkably out of date, and he proposed, therefore, radically to amend them. The attorneys retired, and after a brief interval devised a divorce law that was satisfactory to the president. But the state of which I write was always careful to do things in a constitutional way, for it was a highly civilized, democratic, and reputable country. A president who respects himself and his oath of office cannot promulgate a law, even if it is to his own interest, without adhering to certain forms, and these things take time. The president had barely signed the decree that made the new divorce law valid when a revolution broke out, and he was very unfortunately hanged on a lamppost in the plaza in front of the cathedral that was not without dignity. The young person of pleasing aspect left town in a hurry, but the law remained. Its terms were simple. On the payment of $100 gold, and after a residence of 30 days, a man could divorce his wife or a wife her husband without even apprising the other party of the intended step. Your wife might tell you that she was going to spend a month with her aged mother, and one morning at breakfast, when you looked through your mail, you might receive a letter from her informing you that she had divorced you and was already married to another. Now, it was not long before the happy news spread here and there that at a reasonable distance from New York was a country, the capital of which had an equable climate and tolerable accommodation, where a woman could release herself expeditiously and with economy from the irksome bonds of matrimony. The fact that the operation could be performed without the husband's knowledge saved her from those preliminary and acrimonious discussions that are so wearing to the nerves. Every woman knows that however much a man may argue about a proposition, he will generally accept a fact with resignation. Tell him you want a Rolls-Royce, and he will say he can't afford it, but buy it, and he will sign his check like a lamb. So in a very short time, beautiful women in considerable numbers began to come down to the pleasant, sunny town. Tired business women and women of fashion, women of pleasure, and women of leisure. They came from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. They came from Georgia, and they came from Dakota. They came from all the states in the Union. The passenger accommodation on the ships of the United Fruit Line was only just adequate to the demand, and if you wanted a stateroom to yourself, you had to engage it 6 months in advance. Prosperity descended upon the capital of this enterprising state, and in a very little while there was not a lawyer in it who did not own a Ford car. Don Agosto, the proprietor of the Grand Hotel, went to the expense of building several bathrooms, but he did not grudge it. He was making a fortune, and he never passed the lamppost on which the outgoing president had been hanged without giving it a jaunty wave of his hand. He was a great man, he said. One day they will erect a statue to him. I have spoken as though it were only women who availed themselves of this convenient and reasonable law, and this might indicate that in the United States it is they rather than men who desire release from the impediment of holy matrimony. I have no reason to believe that this is so. Though it was women in great majority who travelled to this country to get a divorce, I ascribe this to the fact that it is always easy for them to get away for 6 weeks, a week there, a week back, and 30 days to establish a domicile, but it is difficult for men to leave their affairs so long. It is true that they could go there during their summer holidays, but then the heat is somewhat oppressive, and besides, there are no golf links. It is reasonable enough to suppose that many a man will hesitate to divorce his wife when he can only do it at the cost of a month's golf. There were, of course, 2 or 3 males spending their 30 days at the Grand Hotel, but they were generally, for a reason that is obscure, commercial travellers. I can but imagine that by the nature of their avocations, they were able at one and the same time to pursue freedom and profit. Be this as it may, the fact remains that the inmates of the Grand Hotel were for the most part women, and very gay it was in the patio at luncheon and at dinner when they sat at little square tables under the arches discussing their matrimonial troubles and drinking champagne. Don Agosto did a roaring trade with the generals and colonels. There were more generals than colonels in the army of this state, the lawyers, bankers, merchants, and the young sparks of the town who came to look at these beautiful creatures. But the perfect is seldom realized in this world. There is always something that is not quite right, and women engaged in getting rid of their husbands are very properly in an agitated condition. It makes them at times hard to please. Now it must be confessed that this delightful little city, notwithstanding its manifold advantages, somewhat lacked places of amusement. There was but one cinema, and this showed films that had been wandering too long from their happy home in Hollywood. In the daytime, you could have consultations with your lawyer, polish your nails, and do a little shopping, but the evenings were intolerable. There were many complaints that 30 days was a long time, and more than one impatient young thing asked her lawyer why they didn't put a little pep into their law and do the whole job in 48 hours. Don Agosto, however, was a man of resource, and presently he had an inspiration. He engaged a troupe of wandering Guatemaltecans who played the marimba. There is no music in the world that sets the toes so irresistibly tingling, and in a little while everyone in the patio began dancing. It is, of course, obvious that 25 beautiful women cannot dance with 3 commercial travellers, but there were all these generals and colonels, and there were all the young sparks of the town. They danced divinely, and they had great liquid black eyes. The hours flew, the days tripped one upon the heels of the other so quickly that the month passed before you realized it, and more than one of Don Agosto's guests, when she bade him farewell, confessed that she would willingly have stayed longer. Don Agosto was radiant. He liked to see people enjoy themselves. The marimba band was worth twice the money he paid for it, and it did his heart good to see his ladies dance with the gallant officers and the young men of the town. Since Don Agosto was thrifty, he always turned off the electric light on the stairs and in the passages at 10 o'clock at night, and the gallant officers and the young men of the town improved their English wonderfully. Everything went as merrily as a marriage bell, if I may use a phrase that, however hackneyed in this connection, is irresistible, till one day Madame Coralie came to the conclusion that she had had enough of it. For one man's meat is another man's poison. She dressed herself and went to call on her friend Carmencita. After she had, in a few voluble words, stated the purpose of her visit, Carmencita called a maid and told her to run and fetch La Gorda. They had a matter of importance which they wished to discuss with her. La Gorda, a woman of ample proportions with a heavy moustache, soon joined them, and over a bottle of Malaga the 3 of them held a momentous conversation. The result of it was that they indited a letter to the president asking for an audience. The new president was a hefty young man in the early 30s who, a few years before, had been a stevedore in the employment of an American firm. and he had risen to his present exalted station by a natural eloquence and an effective use of his gun when he wanted to make a point or emphasize a statement. When one of his secretaries placed the letter before him, he laughed. "What do those 3 old faggots want with me?" But he was a good-natured fellow and accessible. He did not forget that he had been elected by the people, as one of the people, to protect the people. He had also, during his early youth, been employed for some months by Madame Coralie to run errands. He told his secretary that he would see them at 10 o'clock next morning. They went at the appointed hour to the palace and were led up a noble stairway to the audience chamber. The official who conducted them knocked softly on the door. A barred Judas was opened, and a suspicious eye appeared. The president had no intention of suffering the fate of his predecessor if he could help it, and no matter who his visitors were, did not receive them without precaution. The official gave the 3 ladies names. The door was opened, but not too wide, and they slipped in. It was a handsome room, and various secretaries at little tables, in their shirt sleeves and with a revolver on each hip, were busy typing. 1 or 2 other young men, heavily armed, were lying on sofas reading the papers and smoking cigarettes. The president, also in his shirt sleeves, with a revolver in his belt, was standing with his thumbs in the sleeve holes of his waistcoat. He was tall and stout, of a handsome and even dignified presence. "¿Qué tal?" he cried jovially with a flash of his white teeth. "What brings you here, señoras?" "How well you're looking, Don Manuel," said Lagorda. "You are a fine figure of a man." He shook hands with them, and his staff, ceasing their strenuous activity, leaned back and cordially waved their hands to the 3 ladies. They were old friends, and the greetings, if a trifle sardonic, were hearty. I must disclose the fact now, which I could without doubt do in a manner so discreet that I might be misunderstood. But if you have to say something, you may just as well say it plainly as not, that these 3 ladies were the madams of the 3 principal brothels in the capital of this free and independent state. Lagorda and Carmencita were of Spanish origin, and were very decently dressed in black, with black silk shawls over their heads, but Madame Coralie was French, and she wore a toque. They were all of mature age and of modest demeanor. The president made them sit down and offered them Madeira and cigarettes, but they refused. "No, thank you, Don Manuel," said Madame Coralie. "It is on business that we have come to see you." "Well, what can I do for you?" Lagorda and Carmencita looked at Madame Coralie, and Madame Coralie looked at Lagorda and Carmencita. They nodded, and she saw that they expected her to be their spokeswoman. "Well, Don Manuel, it is like this. We are 3 women who have worked hard for many years, and not a breath of scandal has ever tarnished our good names. There are not in all the Americas 3 more distinguished houses than ours, and they are a credit to this beautiful city. Why, only last year I spent $500 to supply my sala principal with plate-glass mirrors. We have always been respectable, and we have paid our taxes with regularity. It is hard now that the fruits of our labors should be snatched away from us. I do not hesitate to say that after so many years of honest and conscientious attention to business, it is unjust that we should have to submit to such treatment." The president was astounded. "But Coralie, my dear, I do not know what you mean. Has anyone dared to claim money from you that the law does not sanction, or that I know nothing about?" He gave his secretaries a suspicious glance. They tried to look innocent, but though they were, only succeeded in looking uneasy. "It is the law we complain of. Ruin stares us in the face." "Ruin? So long as this new divorce law is in existence, we can do no business, and we may just as well shut up our beautiful houses." Then Madame Coralie explained in a manner so frank that I prefer to paraphrase her speech that owing to this invasion of the town by beautiful ladies from a foreign land, the 3 elegant houses on which she and her two friends paid rates and taxes, were utterly deserted. The young men of fashion preferred to spend their evenings at the Grand Hotel, where they received for soft words entertainment which at the regular establishments they could only have got for hard cash. "You cannot blame them," said the president. "I don't," cried Madame Coralie. "I blame the women. They have no right to come and take the bread out of our mouths. Don Manuel, you are one of the people. You are not one of these aristocrats. What will the country say if you allow us to be driven out of business by blacklegs? I ask you, is it just? Is it honest?" "But what can I do?" said the president. "I cannot lock them up in their rooms for 30 days. How am I to blame if these foreigners have no sense of decency?" "It's different for a poor girl," said Lagorda. "She has her way to make, but that these women do that sort of thing when they're not obliged to, no, that I shall never understand." "It is a bad and wicked law," said Carmencita. The president sprang to his feet and threw his arms akimbo. "You are not going to ask me to abrogate a law that has brought peace and plenty to this country. I am of the people, and I was elected by the people, and the prosperity of my fatherland is very near my heart. Divorce is our staple industry, and the law shall be repealed only over my dead body." "Oh, Maria Santissima, that it should come to this," said Carmencita, "and me with 2 daughters in a convent in New Orleans. Ah, in this business one often has unpleasantness, but I always consoled myself by thinking that my daughters would marry well, and when the time came for me to retire, they would inherit my business. Do you think I can keep them in a convent in New Orleans for nothing? And who is going to keep my son at Harvard if I have to close my house, Don Manuel?" asked Lagorda. "As for myself," said Madame Coralie, "I do not care. I shall return to France. My dear mother is 87 years of age, and she cannot live very much longer. It will be a comfort to her if I spend her last remaining years by her side, but it is the injustice of it that hurts. You have spent many happy evenings in my house, Don Manuel, and I am wounded that you should let us be treated like this. Did you not tell me yourself that it was the proudest day of your life when you entered as an honored guest the house in which you had once been employed as errand boy?" "I do not deny it. I stood champagne all round." Don Manuel walked up and down the large hall, shrugging his shoulders as he went, and now and then, deep in thought, he gesticulated. "I am of the people, elected by the people," he cried, "and the fact is, these women are blacklegs." He turned to his secretaries with a dramatic gesture. "It is a stain on my administration. It is against all my principles to allow unskilled foreign labor to take the bread out of the mouths of honest and industrious people. These ladies are quite right to come to me and appeal for my protection. I will not allow the scandal to continue." It was, of course, a pointed and effective speech, but all who heard it knew that it left things exactly where they were. Madame Coralie powdered her nose and gave it, a commanding organ, a brief look in her pocket mirror. "Of course I know what human nature is," she said, "and I can well understand that time hangs heavily on the hands of these creatures." "We could build a golf course," hazarded one of the secretaries. "It is true that this would only occupy them by day." "If they want men, why can't they bring them with them?" said Lagorda. "Caramba!" cried the president, and with that stood on a sudden quite still. "There is the solution." He had not reached his exalted station without being a man of insight and resource. He beamed. "We will amend the law. Men shall come in as before, without let or hindrance, but women only accompanied by their husbands or with their written consent." He saw the look of consternation which his secretaries gave him, and he waved his hand. "But the immigration authorities shall receive instructions to interpret the word husband with the widest latitude." "Maria Santissima!" cried Madame Coralie. "If they come with a friend, he will take care that no one else interferes with them, and our customers will return to the houses where for so long they have been so hospitably entertained. Don Manuel, you are a great man, and one of these days they will erect a statue to you." It is often the simplest expedients that settle the most formidable difficulties. The law was briefly amended according to the terms of Don Manuel's suggestion, and whereas prosperity continued to pour its blessings on the wide and sunny capital of this free and independent state, Madame Coralie was enabled profitably to pursue her useful avocations. Carmencita's two daughters completed their expensive education in the convent at New Orleans, and Lagorda's son successfully graduated at Harvard.